Bible tonight. We're going to the book of Ephesians this evening. Ephesians chapter 6 will be our beginning place and middle place and ending place tonight. And so we ask you to open your Bible and be ready to study with us there in just a moment. While you're opening Bible and getting settled, we welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here on this Sunday afternoon. Hope you had a wonderful Lord's Day afternoon. Hope you're refreshed and ready to study with us for a little while tonight. I want to thank you tonight for the wonderful reception that you gave me among you today, as you always have. You all are so very gracious and hospitable. You always make me feel so very welcome among you, and for that I am very, very grateful. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Many of you mentioned to me this morning, as Max did in our gathering last night, many of you today mentioned to me that you said, you know, Don, since you were here last, your hair has gotten completely white. You're a little more wrinkled and you just look a little bit older. Thank you for pointing that out to me. I had not noticed that on my own, and so thank you for mentioning that to me. And I was just thinking about that as you were saying that to me this morning, that I'd like to ask you a question tonight too, if I might. Have you looked in a mirror in the last 4 years? I mean, I don't think this is just happening to me, but perhaps. Things happen to me that remind me that I really am aging. I started turning gray many, many years ago, and it's interesting how people perceive you. We don't ever perceive ourselves as being quite as old as we really are. Last year was my 40th class reunion at Florida College. I was in the class of 77, and so I'm going on Monday night trying to find our group, trying to find my class, our gathering for our reunion activities after Monday night. And so there are multiple groups meeting in places that are close to each other, and I stick my head in one place, and somebody's coming out, and I said, hey, which class is this? And they said, well, this is the class of 77. I said, great, that was my class. And he looked at me and said, really? What did you teach? That was not what I was looking for. It is not what I was looking for at all. But I understand time moves on for all of us. We want to talk tonight a little bit about honoring mom and dad. I will tell you that I'm greatly encouraged as I look at this audience tonight, and I see in every place in this audience so many young people. So many young people who are here on a Sunday afternoon. I think that says something about you and who you are and what you value. Let me say this as clearly as I know how to say it. I live in a community where through the course of the college school year, I am privileged to interact with literally hundreds of young people. And I do not now, nor have I ever subscribed to the philosophy that our young people are just a generation lost. I do not believe that. I believe that we have among us some of the best and brightest, some of the most morally and ethically sensitive young people to be found anywhere. I believe that we have young people who really are trying to remember their Creator in the days of their youth. And I thank God for that. And I look at this audience and I see so many moms and dads. Moms and dads and grandmothers and grandfathers who are here tonight. And that says something about you too. It says something about the families that you want to have and the priorities in your home and your concern for your children's welfare. It's been a while now, but I remember being young. I remember those days. I remember how young people are often judged by that unholy triumvirate of looks and money and intelligence. I mean, heaven help the young person who is not beautiful or handsome, or whose parents are not moneyed, or who cannot score a 1,500 on their SAT. And intellectually, we know that those are simply man standards. They're not God standards. We all understand that, at least intellectually, and yet I have no doubt that every young person in this audience who is at least in middle school, high school, or college has been judged by those superficialities. And as if that's not enough, you probably learned early on, if you're a young person in this audience, if you're somewhere between the ages of 11 and 18, you learned early on that your mom and dad are not perfect. In fact, you probably feel like if you're between 11 and 18, that when your parents' feet hit the floor in the morning, their first thought is, how can I make them suffer today? My daughter Heather she is now 37 years old, but I remember when she was a teenager, we did not always see eye to eye about everything. And I remember one day when Heather looked at me with complete exasperation and she said, "Dad, do you think that it's your job to make my life miserable?" And I said, "Oh no, honey, it's not my job. It's one of the perks." That was not my best parenting moment. I will confess that. But I simply acknowledge all that to say that I know it's not easy. It's not easy being young. Being young, part of that is to embrace and live Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, where Paul writes, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth." Would you think about that simple statement with me for just a second? Because the Apostle Paul quotes from the fifth commandment. He quotes from the fifth commandment. Now, the first four of God's 10 words in the Decalogue, the first four are vertical. That is, they deal with our relationship with God. And so you can have no other gods before me, no graven images, no name dishonoring, and remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The last six are horizontal in nature. That is, they deal with our relationship with our fellow man. And so they are things like this: do not commit murder. You respect human life and keep sex sacred and keep things in perspective. And so no theft, and tell the truth always, and don't covet anything. But the pivotal command in the 10 is the fifth: honor your father and your mother. And it is absolutely the pivotal command for obvious reason, because we learn to respect God, the vertical relationship, by respecting our mom and dad. And we learn to respect others, that horizontal relationship, by learning to respect and honor our parents in the home. And so maybe that's exactly where we should start, right there, with that simple observation that Paul said, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord." Now, the key word there, of course, is children. And children is a broad-based kind of word. And so if you're in the audience this afternoon and you're 6 years old, then you have parents. You have a mom and dad. If you're 16, you have a mom and dad. But most of you in the audience, if you are 60 years old, you probably have a living parent. And so in all of those age groups, you are still a child. And I point that out simply to say that I think there is something here tonight for everybody. I want to begin with the fact that honoring mom and dad really is a matter of honor. You know, the Bible talks about giving honor to whom honor is due. And of course, that would begin obviously in the home. We tend somehow in American culture to give honor to people that we think deserve it. And so great athletes or politicians that we might admire or successful business individuals, we will honor them. But the Bible says, you honor your mom and dad, not because of what they may have accomplished in life in the business world or the social world, but you honor your mom and dad for who they are. Very much like when you go into a court of law. You may not know much about that judge, and you may not know whether he is a moral or immoral person, but you will address him when you go into a court of law. How? You'll say, "Your honor," because that's who he is. There is a natural and right honor that is given to individuals like that. And so too, first, of course, with our parents. Jesus Christ taught that and lived that. And so Jesus, when he was but a boy, went down with him and he came to Nazareth. He was subject to them. He was obedient to his mother and his father. By this point in time in his life, he at least has some peripheral understanding of who he is, it would seem. But he is still showing honor to his mother and father. I mean, God's view of that is fairly clear. We saw this morning in the book of Colossians chapter 3, "Children, obey your parents in all things, because this is well-pleasing to the Lord." Children, obey your parents in all things. This pleases God. This is why, by the way, the Jews typically thought that the fifth commandment actually went with the first four commandments and not the last four. They believed, or last five, they believed that it went with the first, those commandments dealing with God. Because in the Jewish way of thinking, if a parent was God-ordained spokesman to a child, then to rebel against the parent was ultimately then to disrespect and rebel against God. I got to tell you, I think maybe there's some merit to that. Because when I read from a Jewish writer, the Apostle Paul, steeped in Jewish law, and he is writing in Romans chapter 1 about the Gentile world that God was willing to condemn. And he was talking about all the things that were the antithesis of what God wanted them to be. He said, these people are filled with all unrighteousness and sexual immorality and wickedness and covetousness and maliciousness, and they are full of envy and murder and strife and deceit. They are evil-minded and whisperers. They are backbiters, and they are haters of God. They are violent and proud and boasters and inventors of evil things and disobedient to parents. How in the world did that get there? How in the world did that get in a list that included things like murder and idolatry and being a hater of God? Disobedient to parents. Maybe our Jewish forefathers were onto something about that. That if moms and dads are a God-ordained spokesman to their children, then when children rebel against mom and dad, they are disrespecting and rebelling against God. And so, ladies and gentlemen, honor matters. It matters greatly. And so back in Ephesians chapter 6, God commanded, you shall honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with promise, and the promise is that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. I'm not convinced that what that means is that if you obey your mom and dad, you will live to be 90 or 100 years old. I'm not really sure that's what it's saying at all. It seems to me that God is saying, look, you need to honor your family because family is the bedrock of society. And it's not so much that you're going to live to be 90 or 100, but it is the idea that family is the foundation of a society. And if you want to live long and if you want to prosper and do well in the land that God's given you, family units are going to have to be strong. And so essential to the well-being of any culture, any society, is respecting the family. I mean, think about that with me for just a second. When one learns submission and respect early in the home, then that child naturally is going to be able to grow up and they're going to know how they ought to respect and respond to policemen and teachers and church leaders, lawmakers, and employers. But when a child is successfully disrespectful in the home, it's a prelude, is it not, to disrespect and rebellion both spiritually and relationally. I mean, if a child successfully defies his father and mother, then what chance in the world does a teacher in the school have with that child? If a child successfully defies their father and mother and gets their way constantly by screaming or pouting or manipulating, then what chance in the world does a marriage partner have in getting that mate to respect the law of God? For that matter, ladies and gentlemen, what chance does God have when God speaks in His Word and says, look, you can't do that. I put a boundary line there. You can't go beyond that. If a child has successfully disrespected mom and dad, where they've gotten their first understanding and inklings about God, that child basically is going to respond to God and say, if they don't verbalize it, at least think it, nobody tells me what to do. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, when Moses is giving the children of Israel those final instructions in that series of speeches, he talks about a child that disrespects his parents and disrespects the neighbors of that parents, the culture in which that parents live. And it's interesting that Israel regarded disobedience to parents as a social offense that called in Deuteronomy 21 for a community response. We've gotten a long way away from that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you. Today, one of the quickest ways to make an enemy is to confront a parent about the behavior of their child. But it is a matter of honor, and honor matters. It matters to God. In fact, I think we could say that there is no higher honor that we can give to a human being than we ought to our moms and our dads for the work that they have done with us. Former First Lady Barbara Bush once made this observation. She said, success does not depend on what happens at the White House, but what happens at your house. We would do well to learn from that, wouldn't we? What does that involve? To be people of character, we have to honor our father, our mother, our parents. What might that involve? Well, let me suggest 2 or 3 things in the minutes that we have left tonight. I think number one, it would mean that we respect their role. We respect their role as a mother or as a father. The Hebrew word for honor is a very interesting one. It carries with it the idea, the etymology of the word has to do with to being heavy. It has to do with the weight. You ever say about somebody, I tell you what, they carry a lot of weight with me. What they say carries weight with me. That's the word honor in Hebrew. And so it's saying that you need to deal with your mom and dad in such a way as to indicate to them that they carry a lot of weight with you. What they say matters to you. What they feel matters to you. It was John Calvin who once said, the sum of the commandment, therefore, will be that we're to look up to those whom the Lord has set over us, yielding them honor and gratitude and obedience. And therefore it would follow that everything in the realm of contempt or ingratitude or disobedience is forbidden. I think he's right about that. It's sometimes lost in our culture and our society. But everything in the realm of contempt or ingratitude or disobedience would be forbidden. Well, that would mean then that we would obey their will. That we would obey their will. I mean, God is very clear about this, isn't he? Let's go back to Ephesians 6:1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, it's interesting that it doesn't say, children, obey your parents if you have perfect parents. And obey your parents if you feel like obeying your mom and dad. And obey your parents if you happen to agree with what your mom and dad are asking you to do or with the decisions that they have made. Then you have to obey them. Now, it doesn't say that. It just says obey. Now, there are two qualifiers in the verse. One is the word children in and of itself. There does come a point in time that you will grow and you will no longer be under the auspices, under the authority of your mom and dad. That is a natural progression of life. It doesn't mean that you don't respect them and honor and love them anymore, but there will come a point in time that you are on your own and you will no longer be under their authority. And you have to obey them, the text says, in the Lord. And I take that to mean that there might be an occasion when a parent might ask you as a child to do something that defies the will of God, to cheat, to lie. Maybe a parent who would object, who would oppose you being baptized into Christ when you know that you need to do that. And there have been certainly examples of that, of young people who have been taught the gospel by a friend at school, and their moms and dads oppose them. And yet, in all of that, we have to remember that Jesus said, if you love mom or dad more than me, you are not worthy of me. But for our study tonight, the understanding, of course, is that like it or not, expressing love in a meaningful way, a tangible way to your mom and dad means that you have to obey them. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. It's not optional equipment in the relationship. I mean, when Paul was quoting it, he quoted a part of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And he just quotes it right there. It's right there along with commands like don't kill, don't steal, and by the way, honor your mom and dad. And so children, obey. Well, let me ask you this. If you're a young person in the audience tonight, how should you obey your mom and dad? You ever think about that? Well, I would suggest you ought to obey them in three ways. One, you ought to obey them immediately. You ought to obey them immediately. This should not have to be a battle every time mom and dad tell you to do something. So let me ask you, how many times do your mom and dad have to tell you to do something before you respond? You know what kids learn early on when they are little bitty tiny kids? They learn how far they can push mom and dad. They learn how many times mom and dad will actually say something before they get serious and mean it. We've all seen that. How many times have we seen the meltdown in aisle 3 at Target where some toddler is just having a complete come apart and mom's standing there and doesn't really know what to do? And so mom says something like this, hey, don't do that. I'm telling you, stop that. Stop that right now. I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2. Now I'm telling you, stop it. If you don't stop, you're going to get in trouble. I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 2.5. Now I'm telling you, stop it. Stop it right now. All right, here we go. 1, and the kid's sitting there thinking, this is great. I got a parent who can't even count to 3. How are they going to raise me? But kids learn. Man, they learn early on how far they can push mom and dad. Need to obey immediately. That's part of obedience. Is to obey. You're going to obey anyway. I mean, ultimately, you're going to do what mom and dad tell you or ask you to do because they're mom and dad. And if you're young, they pretty well control your life. It just makes it a lot easier on yourself if you obey immediately. And secondly, without complaint. The Bible talks to all of us, young and old alike, about complaining. Do all things without complaining and without disputing. The Bible just says that we should be beyond that, beyond complaining about everything all the time. Young people sometimes, why is it always my turn? All my friends get to stay out later. You don't want me to have any fun. Well, all of that doesn't help your case, really. And third, you ought to respond wholeheartedly. I mean, if you're a young person here and your mom and dad ask you something simple, like cleaning your room, I mean, do you do the job right, or do you just do it enough to get by and hope that hope that mom and dad will get off your back about that? Immediately, without complaint, and wholeheartedly. I think sometimes young people look at that and they say, you know what, Mr. Don, if I were to obey immediately, without complaint, and wholeheartedly, that'd make me a slave. No, I tell you what, that'd make you the most free person in the world, because your mom and dad probably have a heart attack and die. We need to obey their will. We all obey. Everybody obeys somebody. Everybody has to be obedient. And then you need to value their counsel. Listen to what they say. You know, in Proverbs 1 and verse 8, Solomon said, "My son, hear the instruction of your father, and don't forsake the law of your mother." It's interesting that it begins the Proverbs, a saying of wisdom, by just saying, son, it will always be in your best interest to know that we always have your best interest at heart. And so listen to your dad and don't forsake what your mom says. I would say to the teenagers in this audience in particular, teenagers always want their mom and dad to respect your ideas and your feelings and your thoughts and your wishes. And that's a legitimate request, by the way. But if you want your mom and dad to respect your ideas and feelings and thoughts and wishes, then you need to respect also their ideas and feelings and thoughts and wishes. It's a reciprocal arrangement. There's a natural tendency, I think, particularly when you're a teenager, to feel like that your mom and dad really don't understand. They don't understand a lot about you and where you are in life. And that may be true in many ways. There may be a lot of things about your culture that mom and dad really don't understand. But there are 3 or 4 areas in particular that I want to say to you that you really should listen to your mom and dad, because your mom and dad have tremendous concern for whatever else about your mom and dad. I will tell you there are going to be 3 areas that they will always be concerned about with you. One is your habits, because you know what parents understand? They understand that it's much easier to form a habit than it is to break a habit. You know why parents understand that? Because we've lived that. We've had to undo things that became a habit in our lives, and we remember how difficult it was. Moses gathered his people and he said, as your days are, so shall your strength be. What you spend your time doing is what you'll be good at. Your mom and dad understand that. And so your mom and dad are forever going to want to talk to you about your habits that you're developing. And they'll always want to talk to you about your friends. And you know that. I mean, particularly if you're a teenager, if you're in middle school or high school, you know that your mom and dad, they'll always want to know about your friends and what you're doing with them and where you are with them. Now, the reason for that is that verse that moms and dads love and young people don't care so much for. And that's when Paul said, look, don't be deceived about this. Bad companions will destroy good habits. They'll corrupt good morals, depending on the translation. I think about Proverbs 18 and verse 21, where Solomon said, walk with the wise and you will be wise, but a companion of fools will suffer harm. It's interesting to me, that's not the way I expect that verse to read. Walk with the wise, you'll be wise. In Hebrew parallelism, I would expect that the next phrase, the companion of fools, will become a fool. But that isn't what he says. You walk with the wise, you become wise. But a companion of fools suffers harm. The newer translations say comes to destruction. And so your mom and dad know that. They know that the companion of fools, nothing good's going to come from that for you. And so they're going to be concerned about that. And they're going to be very concerned about who you marry. Because they know that who you marry is going to have the single greatest impact on whether or not you go to heaven or not. Now, we can argue about that, and we can say, look, I'm strong enough, and we can argue however you want about that. But moms and dads understand that that person you marry is going to have a profound impact on your going to heaven. They will either make it so much easier for you to do what is right and serve God and go to heaven when you die, or they can make that extraordinarily difficult for you. Not saying that you can't navigate your way through that successfully, but your mom and dad know that it will be so much easier for you if you have somebody who's pulling in the same direction as you are, as you try to serve God. The problem, I think, often is that young people believe that if they listen to their mom and dad, that they're going to miss out on something. That if they listen to what their mom and dad are saying about their habits and about their friends and ultimately about who they marry, that they're going to miss out on some living that they want to do. They're going to miss out on some life. Could I just ask you, what are you going to miss out on? What are you going to miss out on that's actually good for you? Because here's one thing I know with absolute certainty. I would say this to every young person in this audience. I may not know your moms and dads, right? I may not know your moms and dads, but I know one thing about your mom and dad. I know that your mom and dad have never encouraged you to do something or not do something that they didn't believe was in your absolute best interest. Your mom and dad have never once said, I'm going to tell them to do this because I think it's going to hurt them. Not once, ever. They always have your best interest at heart. Now, I would say to those of you that are in middle school and high school, that as you deal with your mom and dad and there's friction in that relationship, which inevitably from time to time there may be. I didn't put this on your sheet tonight, but you might want to write it down. Let me just tell you 2 or 3 things that will help with that. Number 1, realize. The word realize. Realize that your mom and dad always have your best interest at heart. Always. There is never an exception to that. Your mom and dad will never tell you anything that they don't believe is best for you. Realize they have your best interest at heart. Word number 2, deal with the present. Deal with the present. If you're in a conflict with your mom and dad, deal with right now. Don't deal with the past, not your past, not their past. And don't deal with the future. Tell you what, when I'm 18 years old, I'm out of here. That doesn't help anything right now. It may be true. You may be free to go. But it doesn't make anything better right now. Word number 3 is discuss. Discuss honestly and maturely. I will tell you that when emotion takes over and volume gets raised, reasoning stops. And so just discuss. Moms and dads will talk with you about virtually anything if you'll just do it in a respectful, calm kind of way. And 4th, when you're wrong, when you realize you're wrong, ask for forgiveness. And I tell you, that'll go a long, long way with your mom and dad. You want to talk about something that will help you in the future. Acknowledge when you're wrong and ask for forgiveness. And 5th, the other side of that is, when your mom and dad are wrong, forgive them. There were times when I had to say to my kids, to Josh and Heather, I had to say, look, I was wrong about that. I'm sorry. I'll just have to ask you to forgive me because I was wrong about that. And young people, let me tell you, a good place to start learning to forgive is in your home with your mom and dad. They're not perfect. Because you know what? You're going to have to forgive people the rest of your life. When you get married, you're going to have to forgive your mate, your husband or your wife. There are going to be times you're going to have to forgive them. If you involve yourself in a local church, brethren don't always do exactly as they should. There are going to be times you're going to have to forgive them and learn to move on. A good place to learn that is at home. And 6, seek to improve. Because you're not perfect. Your mom and dad aren't perfect. I will tell you, moms and dads, we try as a grandparent. I'm trying to be a better grandparent now to my grandkids. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to grow. But we all need to do that. We all need to do that. And young people, let me just say about that as you deal with your mom and dad, and you get older, and you are on your own, and you are making your own decisions, and you are free to do so. If you want to break your parents' heart, just disobey God's law. And your mom and dad will spend the rest of their life asking, where did we go wrong? And what could we have done differently? And where did I fail? Life is serious business. We need to value them. And then finally tonight, we need to make sure with moms and dads that we meet their needs. I'm talking to those of us who are a little bit older now. There needs to be an understanding that some obligations never end. Now, there's some truths just generally about dealing with people who are older, right? And so in Leviticus 19:32, you shall rise in the presence of the gray-headed. I kind of like that. I just got to tell you. And you shall honor the presence of an old man. I think Max probably likes that. But in doing that, he said, you show respect to God. When you show respect to those who are older, you're showing respect to God, but in particular toward our parents. There is an honor that just naturally, again, should come to moms and dads. The one who mistreats his father and chases away his mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. When Paul wrote to his young protege, Timothy, he was given instruction about parents and children. He said, by the way, as a child, as your parents age, make sure that you learn to repay your mom and dad. This is good and acceptable before God. And the point of that is that it's not primarily your job and it's not the government's job to care for the mom and dad who cared for me when I was young. That's my job. That's my responsibility. And it's your responsibility in regard to your mom and dad as well as they age. Our parents all did a difficult job. I mean, for 9 months, our mother carried us in her womb. She allowed her body to become disfigured as she carried us. And then in the birth process, she went through labor, as my wife called it, entering the valley of the shadow of death. And when we were babies, we were unbelievably demanding. When you and I were babies, we never once did it ever cross our mind to say, I wonder if this is a good time for me to cry. I wonder if mom and dad aren't busy right now, not doing anything. No, we were extraordinarily demanding. And our parents met those needs. And as we grew, it was ball games in school and athletics and practices and musical instruments, and then in education. And all of that was extraordinarily expensive. And the point is, they did a hard job, and they did it gladly, and they did it well. And when they are older, ladies and gentlemen, we must honor them. It's interesting, isn't it, that when Jesus was dying, at a time of agony that you and I can't even begin to imagine, he was concerned about the care of his mom. I know a lot of people who have echoed that care through the years, countless numbers. Countless people I've known who have agonized over the proper care to give a mom and dad, and when they needed perhaps assisted living or a nursing home care, and then making sure that the care was up to a standard that they wanted. Visiting them daily. I've known people who've added on to their house to make sure that their parents could be cared for by them. Kids who are away, who call frequently to make sure that they keep in touch with their mom and dad. I appreciate it. I will tell you, my son is 34 years old. He lives in Atlanta. We live in Tampa. He calls either his mom or me every night on the way home from work. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. He doesn't have to do that. There's a very real sense that if we live long enough, and if our parents live long enough, there's a very real sense that we will end up inevitably parenting our parents. Unless you think that you can't afford to do that or that's too much of a burden, you just remember that they cared for you when a few hours of neglect would have meant your life. My dad's in heaven. My mom too. But my dad I was extremely close to. My dad and I were very close. In the last couple of years of his life, he lived in the community where I did in Indiana. My mom had passed away. They lived in California. My mom passed away of cancer. And at the end of that year, my dad retired. He had preached for 60 years. And he moved back to where we lived in Plainfield, Indiana at that time. And he had an apartment, and so it was wonderful because I got to see my dad every day. Every day in the afternoon, he'd come by my office, and we would go, and we'd get some coffee or we'd get something to drink, and we'd sit and visit every day. It was wonderful for the last 2 years of his life. But he, too, had cancer. We knew that he was going to die. A while back, Vicki and I, we've lived in the same house for 24 years in Temple Terrace. And a while back, we got everything out of the attic that we had just put up there when we moved in. And we had boxes up there that we had never opened since we moved in. And one of the boxes that I opened, it had an old telephone in it, a landline phone. Some of you young people don't know what a landline phone is, but you can ask your mom and dad. But it was an old phone that we had on the kitchen in our house in Plainfield, and it was on the wall, and it was one of those phones, that you pick up the receiver, and then it had about 8 or 10 buttons, and you could label the buttons, and then you just push the button and it automatically dialed it, right? And so I'm looking at that phone, and one of the buttons says Dad. And I thought to myself, I would give anything that I own in this world to be able to push that button and talk to my dad. Anything. I want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, cherish your family. And young people, you cherish your mom and dad. Because when all is said and done, neither children nor parents are here for very long. And the last thing we want is to have a regret. My dad was a Missouri farm boy. Grew up on a farm, loved the out of doors. And I remember when I was a little boy growing up in California, my dad bought a little 5-acre piece of ground that was woods. It was all trees. And he bought it not to do anything with it, really. He bought it he would go walk on it. Because this reminded him when he was a boy. And so a lot of days he would come by when I was a boy. He would pick me up from school and we'd go to a little donut shop and we'd have some donuts. And then we'd go out and we'd walk. We'd walk in those woods. And as the sun would begin to go down, if we were still there, because I was just a little boy, maybe a kindergartner, I remember this. I remember the shadows coming and being afraid of the sounds that I'd hear. And so I'd just reach up and take my dad's hand. And once I did that, I was completely safe. When I became a Christian, I reached up and I took the hand of God Almighty. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I don't live with fear in this world anymore. I'm looking forward to the time that I get to go home and be with my Father. And if you're in this audience tonight and you need to take the hand of God through the water of baptism or coming home to Him, this invitation's for you. Let's stand. Let's sing.
You a heart that's weak.